Hi, I'm Barnas, and today I wanted to talk to you about something I'm really excited about, and it's called Alphafold 2. I don't know about you, but I've been looking in the news a lot lately and seeing things about politics and maybe the occasional science story about the progress of all the rockets at SpaceX, but I really haven't seen too much about Alphafold, which is potentially one of the most exciting discoveries in science in at least recent decades. Um, I don't really think this discovery is getting the attention it deserves, so I just wanted to talk just a little bit about it. So why is this one of the most important discoveries in science, and in particular in the field of artificial intelligence? Well, AlphaFold is part of Google's DeepMind, and they're famous for having figured out a way to beat the very best players of the game known as Go with a program called AlphaGo. And this happened just a few years ago, and that was all fun and games, but diseases in medicine are not fun and games, and they're actually very big business, and they really impact all of our lives at some point. Health is a very critical thing to us all. So that's why DeepMind chose to turn their attention to the problem of protein folding. And this is actually one of the most complicated things in biology. Years ago, when I was doing my own science fair project, which had a little bit to do with both computers and biochemistry, the Human Genome Project was just beginning to become a thing. It took just around 10 years to sequence the full human genome and figure out the roles of some of these genes in the human body. But a lot has changed since then. Nowadays, with next generation sequencing, the same exact task can be done in something like 10 minutes. And while we know what the DNA code looks like, in reality, there's a big difference between what you see in the DNA code, which is known as the genotype, and what you see in an actual human body, which is known as the phenotype. And that's also similar in the way that you talk about the genome versus the proteome. The genome is the code behind the proteins, and the proteome is what comes out, what actually gets translated from that DNA code into proteins. And the proteome is all the proteins that make up who you are. Well, we know that DNA is what makes us who we are, but translating DNA into a whole human body is an incredibly complicated thing. There are roughly 3 billion nucleotide base pairs that make up our genes, the CGATs you see in all the DNA models. And out of that, there's roughly 30,000 genes. And some genes can make multiple proteins with an average of about 3 proteins per gene, but some genes can make as many as 10. And proteins also interact with each other to make complexes or do other sorts of interactions. So while there may only be a couple 100,000 proteins that make up the actual human body, their interactions are actually pretty complex. And a lot of that has to do with their very intricate shapes. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and while there's lots of amino acids out there in nature, there's really only about 20 or so of these that are commonly used in the human body. And each of these amino acids is encoded in your DNA by 3 nucleotides that are right next to each other, like the CGATs. Because of COVID, maybe some of you are aware that scientists have been targeting these things known as spike proteins. And here's a graphic of it right here. These are the things that coat the outside of the virus. And these are actually only made up of 3,800 base pairs. So you would think that that really isn't a big problem, but actually it's pretty tough stuff. The reason why that's important is because your immune system makes antibodies, and they're very specific. They need to be able to recognize these very specific shapes of the outside of these viruses in order to attach to them and to block the virus from spreading in your body. And this technique is also used by vaccines, which prevent the disease in the first place. So amino acids, let's take a look at, for instance, phenylalanine, which is a pretty common type of an amino acid. And it is encoded by 3 T's right next to each other. And having 3 nucleotides right next to each other is known as a triplet. And it's also synonymous with this word called codons. And that basically just means any 3 of your individual DNA nucleotides next to each other that do turn into a protein, those 3 individual nucleotides encode one single amino acid. And even though we know how to translate DNA into a chain of amino acids, so far scientists have not been able to figure out how to predict the shapes of the proteins that result from these chains of amino acids because of all the complicated steps in figuring out how these amino acids fold together. And let's take a look at some protein structures to get a better idea of what we're talking about here. DNA, which translates into RNA and then becomes a chain of amino acids, they fold up inside your body, and they do that first into what's known as a secondary structure. And then afterwards, they connect to each other a little bit, and they form what's known as a tertiary structure. And this is made up of all sorts of folds and angles and sheets and spirals and other shapes to make these very unique 3-dimensional structures that have to be shaped just perfectly in order to work correctly. Some diseases, for instance, a fairly common one known as sickle cell anemia, are due to misshaped hemoglobin, which you probably have heard about. It's in your blood. And that is actually due to only one single nucleotide mutation. And it can cause a lot of health problems, right? But other things like cancer can cause massive health problems, and those are due to the accumulation of mutations on multiple genes, and they can involve the interactions of lots of misshaped or incorrectly functioning proteins. Alphafold 1, which came out in 2018, was able to achieve what's known as 60 GDT, and GDT is a score that tells you how accurate that the protein folding prediction was. Well, as of this most recent version that we just heard about, Alphafold 2 in 2020 is able to achieve over 90 GDT, which is about the same as or better than human scientists and all their experiments, their physical experiments can do. But instead of years, Alphafold can do this in a matter of days using a relatively small number of computers. Imagine the potential. Solving a problem like this can not only help in figuring out things like virus protein structures, but we could potentially cure diseases that have been plaguing humanity since the beginning of time, including things like cancer. Alphafold and other AI technologies in biology can help solve some of these huge problems in medicine that have been considered nearly unsolvable, and maybe even some of the other big problems that are facing our planet, like hunger, or energy needs, or maybe even the climate crisis. And it's for that reason that I'm hoping that more and more young students can learn AI and learn how to use it wisely.